So we've either done this exactly at the right time or exactly the wrong time, because I don't know if you've been following the news, Tavo. In the past week or so, a whistleblower denounced the fact that Mexico's biggest university, its most important university by far, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, known as UNAM, has been hit by a cheating scandal. The long and short of it is a company was hired to do an exam online, and then the results came back, and it turns out everyone's suddenly a genius. The statistical distribution is completely different from past years, and it turns out that loads of people did outstandingly well. And a teeny tiny amount of people literally took the exam and answered no questions, which makes people think there was a bunch of people who stole the exam and handed it out with the answers, and a bunch of people cheated. It's a big scandal, it's a big issue, it's brought the entire university into disarray because they should have started by now, and they don't have the right cohort because they don't want to accept the cheaters. And so it allows us to dive into the complicated and complex topic of Mexican universities. But counterintuitively, we're not going to start with UNAM. We're going to start with the other side of the paradigm. We're going to start with private universities because, in a way, they all exist in reference to UNAM. So I'm actually quite pleased to start with that.
So if you went back in time to, say, the mid-20th century, even as late as the 1980s, the UNAM reigned supreme in Mexico. There are many other public universities, but the UNAM was where presidents, ministers, CEOs, founders all came from.
Yes, there's this wonderful phenomenon, right? After the Mexican Revolution, what we get is the government by generals for the first few decades, right? Until the 1940s, when we suddenly get government by licenciados, which is what you call people usually who have studied the law at university, and they were almost always licenciados from the national university.
Now, of course, for a very long time, there have been private universities in Mexico. However, their importance really only ramps up significantly in the end of the 20th century. And the beginnings for the most of them are in the 1940s and 60s. However, today, private universities are incredibly important. But let's break down the panorama a little bit of what private universities mean and sort of what percentage they are of the total. And of course, annoyingly, there's very little precise numbers on this. But what numbers we could gather are the following. Roughly about a third of all people who go to university in Mexico go to a private university. So public rules overwhelmingly. Now, interestingly, of that third, roughly a third are actually universities of any repute. And this is something that's really interesting. There's an enormous number of private universities in Mexico that are absolutely useless, basically. The degrees that they offer are legally degrees. Yes, you get a bachelor's degree from these schools, even master's degrees in some cases. But these degrees don't actually teach you much, and most importantly, they are not particularly useful in the job market. I actually worked at one point running a call center, and one of the people in the call center who was making an obscenely low amount of money for a human being, let alone someone with a bachelor's degree, would never stop telling you that he studied a bachelor's degree in psychology. He'd studied at one of these universities.
It actually might be worth stopping here just to subdivide why we got to this position, because it has a lot to do with why people would cheat for the entrance exam at the UNAM. The point is, the UNAM is a massive university. It's got, you probably have the stats, right? It's got like 1/3 students or something. But of course, that's nowhere near enough the amount of students that want to go to university, especially in a country where a university degree is seen as aspirational and necessary to get ahead in life. And so what happened was, there was a boom during what many people would call the neoliberal age of private universities trying to fill that market niche, not with any good education, but with a space where you could basically buy a degree. And people quickly understood that, and that's why they're kind of worthless, even though they're now a sort of minimum requirement. With the arrival of Morena, funnily enough, and we'll discuss this in the next episode, there was a whole new approach to how universities were done. But for a long, long time, it was these placeholder universities that filled in that space.
You make an excellent point there, because there's something that's particular about Mexico. Mexico, of course, is not unique in this, but I think it's an interesting comparison with many other major economies where having a bachelor's degree in Mexico is incredibly important. If you want to have a good salary, if you want to be taken seriously, basically, overwhelmingly, you need a bachelor's degree. If you go, for example, to the Germanic countries, that is not the case at all. an enormous percentage of people in Europe will live perfectly delightful lives and be very successful financially and otherwise without ever having gone to university and without ever having considered going to university.
Do you think this has to do with the sort of obsession with titles? In the same way that it was generals ruling and then licenciados, you sort of need a title. I remember working in the Mexican bureaucracy and it being really important to people that you call them by their right title, to the extent that, of course, people who know the presidents of Mexico before they became presidents really love calling them by their academic title. People still call La Doctora Claudia Sheinbaum by her academic title, but people will also call El Licenciado Andrés Manuel López Obrador and El Licenciado Peña Nieto by their title in what seems like a formalistic way, but actually very important to their identity.
Definitely. I don't know exactly where this obsession with titles comes from, but it's still very much alive. Like even today, if you go to any of the companies owned by Carlos Slim, they will refer to him not as Carlos Slim, former richest man in the world and definitely still exceptionally rich. They will refer to him as El Ingeniero, the engineer. If you went to the Grupo Valls, the holding of the Balleres family, also one of the largest holdings in Latin America, they refer to the patriarch of the family as El Licenciado, because his title was Licenciado. And this happens in very many companies. And it's not just Licenciado and Ingeniero. You've got Licenciado, Ingeniero, Contador, Accountant, Arquitecto, Architect, Doctor, if you're a doctor or have a doctorate. There's a specific few that people use, but it's very important that you get it right.
Some people really like to lean into it. People like to be called biólogo if they studied biology and they want you to know that. Matemático. Very specific. It's no longer about your degree. It's what degree you studied.
Okay, that I haven't seen as much. I can definitely imagine that. But yeah, that is the height of pedantry. But if we go back to this breakdown of the private university system, we had a third of the country goes to a third of university students go to private schools, a third of those go to schools that don't have any particular repute or particular use in the job market. But we're not going to focus particularly on that very massive space. We're going to focus on a much smaller group, which represents only about 2% of people who go to university. And this refers to the elite private universities of Mexico, which overwhelmingly run the show in the country. This wasn't always so. As we said, the UNAM and other public universities were basically unrivaled for a very long time, up to the late 20th century. But today, the enormous majority of posts in the government and in private organizations have people that went to private schools at the highest.
Do you know why that happened?
So it's actually really interesting because there's a sort of different path for all the different universities. And it's partially linked to how they were founded in the first place and in what context they were founded, but it's also linked to the particular history of the country and the economic ups and downs the country went through throughout the 20th century. Before we get into that, I think one of the things that's particularly interesting when you look at sort of how universities work in Mexico and more importantly, how they work in terms of the kinds of power that they afford people is that if you go to a private university with the intention of getting a fancy job and becoming a fancy person in the future, you need to pick the right university depending on what you want to do and where you want to go in a way that doesn't necessarily happen in many other places. So as an example, if you want to end up working in policy in the United States, sure, maybe Berkeley and Georgetown and the University of Virginia might be particularly good because of their historic ties to policy. That's fine. But you can also go to MIT or to University of Chicago or to Brown, or you can go to a less prestigious university with less of a fancy name. It doesn't really matter because you can go to a very large number of universities and still work in policy and still work in engineering and still work in business. A similar thing will happen in many European countries and many of the rich countries in the world in general. But what happens in Mexico is, for example, if you want to be a doctor, it's well understood that you most likely want to go to Mexico City and that you most likely want to go to the Anáhuac of the North or to La Salle. That's just the way things go. And there are other schools that will teach you medicine, but for some reason, they've decided that these are the ones that get you to the high places. And to a degree, that's true. If you want to become sort of a big deal in the world of business and, join the upper echelons of business and economics and of business and money making in the country, there are, of course, private universities throughout the country. Every sort of major city has its own particular private university that everyone's like, that's the prestigious one. And Mexico City in particular has a couple. I'm going to name a few of these because they're going to keep coming up because there's not that many of them. You have the Universidad Iberoamericana, often called La Ibero. you have the Anahuac, and then you have the TEC, and you have the ITAM. All of these are major universities that sit in Mexico City. And then, of course, you've got in Monterrey, you've got the TEC as well, and you've got another one in Puebla, and you've got another one in Guadalajara, and so on. But everyone knows that if you want to go into business, you want to go to one of these universities. What varies significantly, however, is what kind of business you want to do, and more importantly, how you want to get to the highest echelons of business. So something that's interesting is the Anáhuac del Norte, which is a feeder for an outrageous number of CEOs and high-level executives in the country, has a very particular history and a very particular way of getting people to power in these particular functions. A huge number of private universities in Mexico are actually founded by the church. You have the Ibero founded by the Jesuits. You have the Anáhuac, famously founded by Los Legionarios de Cristo. You have the Universidad Panamericana, and so on.
Crucially, the religiousness of these universities isn't necessarily a function of a religious revival in Mexico. In fact, I would argue quite the opposite. Bit of a name drop here. It's something I cover quite extensively in the book I recently published, which I will link in the show notes. The right doesn't exist, and yet there it is. And it's basically the fact that more or less at the end of the 20th century, what you see is a movement away from state-led endeavors. That's from the economy, but also in universities. This is more or less when it goes out of fashion to come from the public university and private universities start being picked. Now, crucially, private universities to an enormous extent act as social clubs. This is why, as you well say, Tavo, universities are really good for specific things. Sure, it might be because they're very good at medicine or they're very good at business, but it's also because of the connections you form at each one of these. They're almost like the sororities and the fraternities at individual US universities with specific strengths and specific groups of people. Very similar to this. And so when you get the Legionaries of Christ founding the Anáhuac, what you get is a group of people who want to be part of a private organization away from the state, and that eventually comes to power first in business, and then when the business people take over politics, in politics. And that's when you get this flood of people from specific universities. And fascinatingly, every administration from that point onwards, say from the 1980s until the present day, has different cohorts from different universities at different stages. So, for example, during the age of El PAN and the PRI, in the sort of democratic age in the past few decades, and most of them came from your alma mater, the ITAM, but I'm sure you'll get into that.
Going back to the Catholic universities, we contrast two particularly important ones, the Ibero, created by the Jesuits, and the Anáhuac by the Legionaries of Christ. One is founded in the 40s, the Ibero, and the Anáhuac is founded in the 60s. And that particular historicity is particularly interesting when you also see the kinds of networks that people have in these universities. So the Ibero, founded in the 40s, like many other private universities at the time, fits very clearly into the beginning of the new era of Mexico of the 20th century. It's finally pacified after the revolution. The PRI has absolute control. There's stability, and the economy begins to grow. And you get the beginning of sort of Mexico's golden age, which lasts for slightly more than 20 years. And it all really starts in the 1940s. And it's clear that now there is a space not just for the public system, but that you also need a private system. This is not, Mexico was never a communist country. Modern Mexico emerges from a socialist-minded revolution, but always perfectly open to capitalism. And once things are completely pacified after the revolution, that private capital begins to be able to thrive.
Of course, there are different ways, right, of how left or right wing the government is, even though it was a single party. And you get a lot of the resistance coming from the universities. We've discussed this when we discussed the founder of the PAN, and we talk about how the UNAM was a crucial thing. But a lot of people said the UNAM was too far gone. It was too liberal, too socialist. And so you get open rebellions against that left-wingness coming from academics and intellectuals, and eventually universities like ITAM. ITAM is very explicitly founded on the basis of being a free market response to the UNAM, which was seen as too state-based.
Exactly right. And within that, once again, the contrast between Ibero and the Anáhuac, the Ibero comes in and initially has a very big focus on economics and administration, though of course it has also the humanities, and it is particularly renowned for the humanities even to this day. But being founded by the Jesuits, which have a long history in the country, it always kept a focus on humanities and, more importantly, on a humanist view of education. So while the university today is associated with networking and with the kids of the very, very rich studying there, it is very much focused on sort of the ethics of it all, and with a big focus on the value of the humanities as well, like more well-rounded individuals, which is important, particularly when you contrast it to the Anáhuac.
And that's why it's, if you're looking for a human rights program, lawyers who will defend you pro bono if you feel you're being repressed by your government, that's the sort of university you want to look to, because that's the sort of education that they got.
It's important to know that these schools, while they are renowned for networking for the rich with the rich, the quality of the school is exceptionally high. And that is something that has always been the case. And it is well known to be the case. When you look at the Anáhuac is founded 20 years later. And I think that is very representative of the sort of network that it has and the mindset that it has, where it also has many of the kids of the ultra rich. But when you talk to them about starting school, they say, well, I mean, I could go to the ITAM, which is, has this sort of nerdy, brainy reputation. I don't want to work that hard. I can go to the Ibero, but I still have to work pretty hard. Or I can go to the Anáhuac. I don't have to work that hard. And I will also get the job. And ultimately, I'm inheriting the company. Now, this is not a hypothetical conversation. I have had this conversation with a person who will remain nameless, but it was the heir at the time to a major publishing house. And his dad had studied at the ITAM. And I said, well, what are you studying? And that was his exact response. And this is a response that you will get from many people when referring to the Anáhuac.
All hate mail, please, directed to Tavo Figueroa.
And this is, of course, a simplification, because while he might have said that, and that might be said by many people, he's not wrong in the sense that the school has focused on maintaining a certain quality of education. It does acknowledge a reality that these people are going to inherit the companies. You're going to have the brainy person working for you. The kind of preparation that you need is slightly different.
You can see this very much when it comes to how much these universities cost. Whereas the public universities are free, these elite private universities can be incredibly expensive. And a university like Anáhuac, maybe you're not getting in because you're particularly academic, but you're definitely getting in because you have an enormous amount of money. That you can be very clever and be at the Anáhuac, but you can't be particularly poor, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who get very good scholarships, but there is a very clear understanding that it is the moneyed people who go to these universities. That's the sort of networks they're looking to create.
Certainly. And even the Anáhuac, which has the worst reputation in this sense, there is no measure of doubt that it has several programs that are absolutely world-class. For example, some of the best doctors, medical doctors in Mexico, study at the Anáhuac, and they have continued to ensure that the Anáhuac has a very high level in medicine. It is where the Cordon Bleu has its association in Mexico. If you want to learn cooking at the highest levels, you go to the Anáhuac.
So please don't send us your hate mail. We love you. It's just, let's face facts. It is an unaffordable university for most people.
And now, because they do have these sort of pockets or particular degrees in which they have a very high level of education, particularly the Ibero, which has a very vast range of options and a very high level of education, you don't just get the kids of rich people studying here. You also get just smart people who, in the case of the Ibero, are sort of have a very humanist approach, or in the case of the Anáhuac, want to study medicine specifically or cooking and so on. And there are other universities that sort of feeders into this sort of technical or technically minded middle and upper middle class. La Salle, which is also a particularly famous school for studying medicine in Mexico City, falls into this bucket. But then you get into another big group of universities for which I believe there is only one major private university that plays in this field, and this is the technocrats. Now, this is an interesting thing because this is changing with the current administration and the administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the previous president. But the ITAM University, where I studied, was from the late 1980s all the way until the end of Enrique Peña Nieto's presidency in 2018, where the overwhelming majority of the highest level technocrat ministers from the country trained. Now, it's important to mention here that, of course, that doesn't mean that this is the only university that creates high-level technocrats. There were technocrats coming from other universities from all over the country, particularly from public universities like the CIDE and the Colmex, which we'll cover in our next podcast. But the ITAM was, for a good 20 years, the undisputed champion of producing technocrats for Mexico.
It arguably still holds a very close place to the government's heart because despite it becoming unpopular amongst the Morena government, saying that all these neoliberals were coming from the ITAM and imposing their ideology on the government, look closely at the core technocrats of the Claudia Sheinbaum government, for example, including the head of the digital agency, which we discussed recently as being very empowered, having an AI policy, being in charge of all the tax collection. The guy at the head of that very important agency close to the president is from the ITAM. He was, in fact, a professor there.
For good reason, too, right? The ITAM, for all its many failures, and I think probably the most important one, the criticism that Andrés Manuel López Obrador and people around him have often directed at the ITAM, is that it was a university by neoliberal technocrats for neoliberal technocrats. I remember actually coming out of a class very early on in my tenure there on the history of economic thought, and written on the blackboard as we were leaving was the word Prebisch, which refers to an Argentinian economist of particular importance in Mexico because his ideas were basically the foundation of the industrial policy of Mexico when Mexico grew miraculously for 20-something years. So an important person to discuss in a class on the history of economic thought. But as we were leaving the class, the vice dean at the time was coming in, and he saw the word on the blackboard, and he said out loud, "I can't believe that you're teaching Prebisch. What, are you going to teach Marx as well?" Which is an insane thing to say, because the answer is yes. It's a class on the history of economic thought. Of course you need to read Marx, even if you don't agree with the man. And there are many stories like that in the DAM. But notwithstanding, the ITAM continues to be a major feeder for technocrats for the government, not only for the Mexican government, but also for international organizations world over, because it's a very good school. And the things that it has focused on, for example, law, economics, mathematics, amongst others, it has a particularly high level of education, and its students often will end up going to some of the best universities in the world. As an example, my cohort of in the economics degree when I was there, the group of people who had the highest grades, the enormous majority of them went on to do doctorates in economics at the University of Stanford, of MIT, the University of Chicago, NYU, all notoriously difficult universities to get a PhD in economics from.
I'm curious to see which private universities you think are starting to nip at ITAM's technocratic heels.
That's an excellent question, and the honest answer is, to my knowledge, no one even comes close. I think the reality is, and I remember working at the Mexican Central Bank, we had people from other schools. We had some people who had studied at La Salle, specifically for economics roles, because the lawyers that work in government obviously study elsewhere, and many study elsewhere. We'll talk about some of those schools in a second. But I think for me, the big competitors, the big names, were always the public ones. Is that changing in your mind?
I think you're quite right. I think basically the answer is exactly what you say, which is no one's close to ITAM yet in the private sector, in the sphere of private universities, and yet I start to detect a few changes. One of the biggest changes between even the past administration, still Morena under Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and the current administration under his protege Claudia Sheinbaum, is a change in how hard they're going on industrial policy. And one of the big issues that they're facing is it's industrial policy financed by the private sector. And so you start to see inklings, very interesting inklings, of a new university starting to feature increasingly in discussions around public-private industrial policy. And that's probably the next university you want to talk about, because it makes perfect sense, and that's the TEC de Monterrey, the Technological University of Monterrey, which was created to create business people.
It's really interesting that you say that. Because as you asked that question, and I was thinking that over, I think one of the big problems that the ITAM has is that despite it being very good and whatnot, and when you look at the KPIs, let's say, it does have a problem of being profoundly dogmatic, and there is a certain way to do things. And if I think of like the program that we studied, and I was a teacher there for a brief period about 7 years ago, nothing had changed since I graduated. I doubt as much has changed since. So when I look at how things have changed, and the government now wants to work more actively with the private sector, the ITAM does not believe in that. The ITAM believes in separating. It's a bit of an idea of a separation of church and state. The state's over there regulating, and that's it. And the private sector has its own role, which is to run the economy, basically, or to drive the economy. But the tech is particularly well suited to take on this role because the Tech is, for lack of a better word, scrappy, I would call it. Because they're from the north, they're from Monterrey, and this fits into all the stereotypes beautifully because they don't care about dogma. The point is to do business. We got to make money. How are we gonna make money? Let's talk it out. I don't care. Let's put it on the truck. We'll sell it. It'll be fine. And they've built an entire ecosystem of universities. There's not just one Tech. There is only one ITAM. But the Tech has campuses all over the country, most famously in Monterrey and Mexico City, but universities all over the country. And they're particularly renowned for business administration and entrepreneurship.
And they've grown to such an extent because, of course, it is a business that makes businesses. It's no charity, this university, like the Jesuits or whatever. These people are hard-nosed business people where the university itself is a business, right, to a large extent. And so it's fascinating to see how much they've grown and therefore how they've become Mexico's second university. Maybe ITAM is far more academically elitist or whatever, but it's a very, very small university compared to El Tec de Monterrey, which is a titan and therefore has enough money to invest in all the sorts of things that the rankings like. And so it's consistently placed right behind UNAM as the second best university in Mexico.
To that point, actually reminds me of something a professor of mine said while I was still studying at the ITAM, and it was a class on economic growth. And he was saying, like, wow, the Tec de Monterrey is a great university. I always tell people from the Tec de Monterrey it's an amazing university. Like, look at McDonald's, for example. It is an amazing business. It has so many locations, and they're all very profitable. It's an amazing business. But, the ITAM is a 3 Michelin star restaurant. And that is sort of the eternal war.
That's exactly what Itamita would say.
That is exactly what Itamita would say. I don't subscribe to that, but that is definitely sort of the mindset. But I think it also goes back to, the ITAM is founded by a billionaire family in the 1940s as part of this project of, creating industry for the country, as you say, in response to the overly socialist vision of the UNAM as seen at the time. The Tec de Monterrey is also founded in the 1940s by a group of ultra-rich people from Monterrey to do the exact same thing. Just while the ITAM has focused on being elitist and highly academically focused, the Tec has focused on a different approach, equally necessary and arguably a lot more necessary today than what the ITAM has to offer.
And it works within the stereotypes, right? Because this is the hard north. This is where the 1940s Monterrey was a little town. People had to go to the neighboring state to see a proper city. And the Tec is the first sort of attempt to create a university before even the state really put its back into it. And so you've got the private sector creating a university to create Monterrey and to create the business of Monterrey. Whereas ITAM is in the heart of Mexico City. And therefore it was trying to administer existing businesses, already sort of thriving commerce. And so you get the stereotype perfectly there. I think quite a negative stereotype if you take it to its sort of conclusion, which is something the current governor of Monterrey said, which is in the north we work and in the center of the country they administer. And that, to me, I think is a complete oversimplification, but it's also really interesting because at least when it comes to these universities, it's very much the case.
Definitely, and I think when you look at the curricula, it's also very much the case. The Tec de Monterrey is focused on making stuff happen, teaches you about cash flow, teaches you about coming up with an idea that works and making it work, and that's it. Whereas places like the ITAM and many others like it, public as well, in Mexico City, are very interested in lofty ideas that you can perfect in a doctorate at MIT, but aren't particularly useful to get money flowing on the ground in poor places today.
Which brings us back to the reason why El Tec is such an interesting new ally to the government. Maybe not ally, but definitely their interests have aligned because the government doesn't care about lofty ideas. They've done lofty ideas. They've got Mexican humanism, for example, which we covered in the Mexican Political Economist. Now they need people who do stuff, and the Tec de Monterrey gets stuff done. In theory, if you've ever worked with the Tec de Monterrey, good God, is it a machine to create bureaucracy? But, the theory is still there.
But of course, so far we've talked about the ultra-rich, we've talked about business and networking and medicine. But this country has been governed by one particular degree for basically 150 years. And that degree is law. Lawyers rule the country. Since roughly the 1980s, lawyers have become slightly less relevant, but they're still incredibly powerful. They still run the show to an extraordinary degree. The enormous majority of the presidents of Mexico have been either generals or lawyers. And since the end of the revolution, it's been overwhelmingly lawyers. And where do the lawyers study? Of course, there are universities in all of the states where you can study law. But overwhelmingly, Mexico City is the place to study law, even if you want to then practice in the different states of the country. And here, the ITAM plays an important role. The Ibero plays a very important role as well. Other universities play a big role. But there are two universities which are particularly important. One is La Universidad Panamericana, the Pan American University, also founded by a religious order, by the Opus Dei, or in alliance with the Opus Dei. It is now also an important business school as well. They run the IPADE, probably the most, actually not probably, unequivocally the most prestigious MBA program in the country. But the titan of them all is La Escuela Libre de Derecho. The UP is important because it still produces an enormous number of very important lawyers. It has produced, notoriously, one Mexican president. Very few private universities have produced a Mexican president. One was the Ibero with Vicente Fox, who was the first president after the PRI in the year 2000. He studied business administration. And then in 2012, you have Enrique Peña Nieto, the return of the PRI. He started the Universidad Panamericana. But in 2006, and famously, he plagiarized his bachelor's thesis.
I was going to say, did he really study at the UP?
He went there.
Yeah, he definitely was physically here, I guess.
Or at least enough times to get the degree.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I say here because I live basically in the UP campus. My building is full of students vomiting down the hallways and screaming and shouting when graduations come about. It's a lovely neighborhood to live in, actually.
The wonders of university. But from 2006, you have Felipe Calderón. And Felipe Calderón studies at La Escuela Libre de Derecho, which holds the title of Mexico's oldest private university. And I think it's a good one to end on, this sort of listing of our universities that rule the country. La Escuela Libre de Derecho is literally the free school of law. And I never knew what that meant until I researched it for this podcast. Escuela Libre is very like sort of Holy Roman Empire, like the free cities of the Holy Roman Empire. It's a university that sits aside from, it's untouchable by the government. By decree, the government makes it untouchable. It is accountable to no one. They decide their own curriculum, and they cannot be shut down by anything other than decree.
Before autonomy, before the autonomous national university, you had liberty, you had the free university of law in Mexico. I didn't know that. It's fascinating.
And it actually emerges because you have the National School of Jurisprudence or something of this sort. And that's where all the lawyers used to come from for a period. And there's a fight, and a bunch of the professors decide to leave and set up their own university. Interestingly, one person who studied there and became president in the 1920s decides to make the school a free school. He's like, well, this is my alma mater. We need to raise it to the appropriate level. And what's really interesting about the Escuela Libre de Derecho is it is draconian. It is so antiquated and everything. And not just the name, but it's a weird thing where it was founded basically by professionals. And in the spirit of the law, if you want to practice law, you need to practice. That is how you learn the law. Sure, you need to read some things, but you need to practice. So famously, all of the professors are only paid a symbolic salary. And you get some of the finest lawyers in the country teaching there, because to teach there is an enormous honor.
No idea about any of that.
It also continues to have the incredibly archaic exam system of everything basically sitting on single exams. I believe it's every semester. I don't remember if it's every semester, every year, that you have one exam. It's an oral exam. And if you fail that, you have to do everything again.
I mean, that's very Oxford and Cambridge. Everything rests upon the final exam.
And very much in the spirit of Oxford and Cambridge, it's very prestigious. It likes to sit on, the laurels of its great achievements of the past. There is no, aside from the UNAM, there is no greater law school in the country than the Escuela Libre de Derecho. Even the students of the ITAM and the Ibero who will thump their chests at the greatness of the universities will accept that La Libre rules supreme. But it is archaic. And I think that brings us into an important open question on whether these stereotypes will continue. Mexico has a private education system where you study, as I said at the beginning, will grant you sort of God-given access into a particular echelons of power. If you go to La Libre and you manage to graduate, which is incredibly hard, but if you manage to graduate, you will be a successful, rich lawyer if you so wish. And similarly with the other universities in their own particular areas of expertise and associated social circles. But one of the problems with that is that sort of banks on the fact that the social system continues to work the same way, and the same people who've always been at the top continue to be at the top. So of course you will get the fancy job you came out of the Libre, because the people who study at La Libre have all the fancy jobs. So they'll hire you and your life is set. Well done. Congratulations. But what happens when you have a massive restructuring of the country? What happens when, for example, a president comes in and says, I don't like this game, and I think we need to restructure it? What happens to these universities, particularly the ones that are really set in their 100-year-old ways?
It's definitely something that is worth discussing at length, and maybe we'll start touching upon it on our next episode. Because ultimately, you're right, Mexico does feel like it's changing, the economy's changing, who's in power is changing, and so ultimately, who gets to stay in power at the academic level to sort of nurture the rest of the country's elites is a sort of open question at the moment. And you can see the universities that are surviving and still thriving, even though they seem like they're anathema to the current government's ideology. You start to see where their real power lies, not in necessarily the connections they have, but actually, perhaps, maybe, just maybe, in their academic excellence. It's sort of chicken and egg, right? Because it's the universities with the money because the rich have founded them and funded them, and therefore it's the universities with the capability of producing, having the infrastructure, hiring the best teachers. It's very difficult to separate. But I don't think the argument is, will the rich stop being powerful and influential in the government? It's, even if the government wants to go against you, can it afford to get rid of you completely? Either because you own the money, and so it needs you to invest in the country, as we're seeing with the Tec de Monterrey, or because actually it turns out this university funded by billionaires is creating the best technocrats in the country, even though I hate this university, as we've seen with ITAM.
I fully agree. It'll be a balance, and there's no way of restructuring everything. Like, even if you start, taking people to the guillotine and starting from scratch, there are structures. There's a certain way in which things have worked for a very long time. And some of those things actually work quite well.
Political commissars. That's what we need.
But until they're here with us, this was Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're covering exactly what makes Mexico tick, who's in charge, and who's funding it all.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist, and stay tuned for Chapter 2 of Mexico's Universities.